Welcome, everyone. We're just about to get started in a couple of minutes. I know we have some people logging on right now, and we are here this afternoon on our Mid-Coast Maine lunch hour, but Margaretta Lovell is joining us for a breakfast talk out on the West Coast, but we're thrilled to have her with us today to talk about Fitz Henry Lane and painting the inhabited landscape. And I see a couple more people logging on with us. So just going to wait another second or so as I do my best to pause here. Hope you're all having a sunny day where you are. We are now getting officially the summer that we've been waiting for here in Mid-Coast Maine. We've got hazy, hot, and humid, and I think we've got some rain coming. So if anything, it's a delightful day to think about a trip to the sea with Fitz Henry Lane. So Margaretta will be our guide for the afternoon here. And it's just about 12:30, so I'm going to welcome everyone to the Farnsworth Art Museum online as it is today. And we do have a wonderful talk with Dr. Margaretta M. Lovell, who is the J.D. McEvoy Jr. Chair in the History of the American Art Department at UC Berkeley, joining us for a wonderful lecture about Fitz Henry Lane. I want to thank you all for supporting us here at the Farnsworth Art Museum and everything that you do, whether it be joining us online for a talk such as this, or coming into the galleries, or for future programs that we have here at the Farnsworth. I also want to thank our public programs coordinator, Abigail Nash, who is running our tech here in the background and helping us out today. So thank you to Abby for joining us. Margaretta's book, which was recently published by Penn State University Press just in 2023, just earlier this year, Painting the Inhabited Landscape, Fitz H. Lane and the Global Reach of Antebellum America, is an interesting account of taking us back into the 19th century, but really more of a global look at Fitz Henry Lane's practice, but also the landscape in which he worked in. Margaretta is a cultural historian working in the intersection of history, art and architectural history, anthropology, and I saw also some studies in material culture, painting, design, of course, as well. Previous studies include parts of England, France, and North America from the 17th century to the present in what she has been looking at. Margaretta has also received her PhD in American Studies at Yale and has taught as visiting professor in the history of art departments at Stanford, Harvard, and University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. She began her teaching career at Yale with degrees from Yale, University of Delaware, and Smith College. Margaretta's scholarship is interdisciplinary and strives to mobilize visual artifacts to answer cultural, social, political, and economic questions, all things that are quite very timely to us right now. Her book on painting the inhabited landscape contemplates the artist of Fitz Henry Lane, the nature of his art making within the global perspectives of his culture's links with China, Puerto Rico, Ireland, and California. So I know that Margaretta will have lots of fascinating information for us. So if you're at home listening and you think you have a question that you'd like Margaretta to answer, feel free to put it into the Q&A box, and we'll have a few minutes at the end to chat with Margaretta and see if we can get all of those questions answered. So Margaretta, thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to have you share your screen, and we'll step into the world of Fitz Henry Lane.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction, Gwendolyn. It's a great pleasure to be, I will say here, but I should probably say there with you today. I wish I could be there in person, but we're going to be doing this by this, brand new way of communication that has been so invaluable for us over these last 5 years, our good friend Zoom. This talk is about 45 minutes. And yes, I'll be really happy to answer your questions or take your comments at the conclusion. I'm going to focus on two key parts of this new book that was published in April. It focuses on Lane's 20-year career. It's a relatively short career for a painter in the 1840s and the 1850s and just into the cusp of the 1860s. During this time, he made at least 6 trips to very productive summer trips to coastal Maine. This book that I've just had the pleasure of finishing and putting in the hands of readers takes a very different look at Lane. It is a revisionist view of Lane's work. My sources for establishing a new reading of Lane's work include newspapers and diaries, letters, maps, his drawings, and above all, the paintings themselves. And what I've attempted to do is to see the world through his eyes and those of his contemporaries. Try to understand how they understood the world. So I'm looking particularly closely at the paintings and within the paintings at what other scholars have called incidental detail that they don't find very interesting, but I find absolutely central. Today's talk I will look particularly at the chapter called Lumber, which concerns his main paintings, and the chapter called Travelers 2, which concerns works that Lane produced for probably his best patron, a man named Sidney Mason from Gloucester. Other chapters include a focus on fish and granite and canvas, and they establish the links that we find in his paintings between New England and Suriname, California, China, and Ireland. Lumber is a chapter about Maine, the Maine that Lane knew from his cruising with friends in a sloop and camping out around Penobscot Bay, and from his weeks staying with the parents of his good friend Joseph Stevens in their home in Castine. I've indicated on this 1836 map the location of Castine, Mount Desert, and Owl's Head, three important sites for Lane's trips and his painting in Maine. In September of 1850, a correspondent for the Gloucester Telegraph reported that Mount Desert, while formerly understood to be barren and desolate, frequented only by fishing craft, became, to an eye re-educated to picturesqueness, a site that could, and he, as the journalist went on, boast of scenery so grand and beautiful as to be unsurpassed by any in the whole of America's coast. So this quickly made this part of Maine a magnet for mid-century artists. This enthusiastic writer, one of the company of Gloucesterites who sailed and camped out and hiked on the uplands of the island, goes on to enumerate the artists on Mount Desert in the summer of 1850. We heard of George Bonfield and Virgil Williams, who has reluctantly left but a short time before. Alvin Fisher had spent several weeks there. Benjamin Champney and John Kensett were in another part of the island, and we have reason to believe that Frederick Church and some others were in the immediate vicinity. And Lane, who was with us, made good additions to his portfolio. The scenery sought out by these artists was generally wild nature, often seen from an eminence, such as we see in this oil sketch by Frederick Church. This is the Maine that pictures the viewer as almost as the first human to see this pure nature that Maine represented for him, Church. Church was by far the more celebrated artist, far more so than Lane, and he painted the Maine that his New York patrons wanted to see in portable, paintable, and purchasable form. Church's Maine is virtually, as I say, an untouched landscape. This was an extremely powerful fiction in the making and selling of images, and an extremely powerful force in promoting the doctrine of manifest destiny and the myth of an empty continent, a virgin land, voided by retreating or assimilating or deceasing Native Americans. Lane, on the other hand, turned his attention to the harbors and townscapes and to the activities in Maine revolving around lumber. This is why I call my book Painting the Inhabited Landscape, to underline the difference between the usual, what we can call the Frederick Church view of America in the 19th century, and the way Lane understood it for and with his patrons. Here in Entrance to Somme Sound from Southwest Harbor, a stunningly beautiful painting The hold of a brig is being loaded with dimensioned lumber, cut in the distant forests and milled in one of Mount Desert's 6 busy lumber mills. More planks will be loaded onto the deck for the voyage to distant markets. Lane portrayed focused vignettes of specific lumbering activities, such as loading wood here, rather than attempting to portray the vast scale of Maine's primary extraction industry. Wood was big business. In 1850, when Lane and his fellow artists were spending their summers in Maine to find subjects for paintings, lumbering in the Penobscot watershed employed 10,000 men. And in 1866, the yearly timber crop of the state was worth, in 1866 money, $20 million. According to one observer, by the middle of the 19th century, immense tracts of land all along the coast of Maine, from the St. Croix to the Penobscot, were clear-cut and thus presented what that observer called a desolate and forbidding aspect. Most painters steadfastly averted their eyes entirely from extraction industries and from commerce. Just as entrance to some sound from Southwest Harbor evokes an activity that was omnipresent, a single outbound topsail schooner loaded high with boards in the equally magnificent lumber schooners at evening on Penobscot Bay stands for hundreds of coasters moving south with this valuable cargo through the spring, summer, and fall months. These vignettes of the lumber industry were offered as singular examples, meticulously articulated portraits of everyday activities that were characteristic of this place at that time, often set here, as we see here, in a poetic framework of a transitional time of day, in this case, evening, sometimes dawn. These pictures are about a working landscape, brigs and schooners, and the workers and mariners who loaded and managed them. And these paintings are about the larger economies and the connections in which these activities participated. While describing particular activities and cargoes, they often also reference the cutting of thousands of trees deep in Maine's remote forests, vast log drives, thundering sawmills, and treacherous journeys through tempestuous seas, and eventual purchase and consumption in the production of houses and barns, wharves and ships, barrels and buckets in cities near and far. The protagonist in this image is a vernacular vessel, cunningly constructed and managed to produce motion, to enact human will. It's a technologically complex fabrication of wood and rope and canvas and metal fittings designed to harness wind and move a heavy cargo through the resistant medium of water to a far distant place. This topsail schooner, with its cargo so lyrically poised against an ombre sky, is part of a vast national and even international market for the primary building material in North America. The seemingly quiet scene portrays one moment in the career of one of hundreds of coasters that carried this profitable crop south to Gloucester and Boston, Charleston, and the West Indies, even Australia. Each coaster averaging 3 to 17 round trips a year. Most commentary on these images is about geometry. And I quote, formal patterns and contrasts of dark against light, diagonals against the horizon line. They see the scene, and again quote, as purified by the suppression of extraneous detail. But I'm encouraging you to look at the details in Lane's paintings to understand them as anything but extraneous. Lane's paintings appear to depict quotidian moments of no consequence, but their details point to international as well as local concerns, and to the integration of humans into both their environment and the global economy. The key implied ingredients here are valuable, extractable resources, human labor and ingenuity, and the linkage to larger communities and economies. From the shaggy forests of Maine to the finished houses and ships and barns of the eastern seaboard, human activity and its material culture constituted a single system in which ships, people, logs, lumber, and money moved in continuous productive cycles. The most prized New England tree was the white pine, flourishing especially near riverbanks within old-growth forests on the cusp between the spruce fir forest of northern Maine and the beech, birch, maple, hemlock forest of southern New England, and reaching a height of 200 feet or more with a straight, smooth trunk. The white pine yielded wood that was lighter and softer and freer of knots, more durable and with a greater proportion of heartwood than any other. And since it was easier to work than other woods, it involved lower labor costs. It was particularly prized for ship's masts and was thus embroiled in political and military as well as economic and artisanal narratives from the 16th century. Most structures in antebellum America and many abroad were framed and clapboarded with white pine timbers and boards, and the major bridges in early America were built of white pine. The boards, and to a lesser extent the timbers, posts, palings, lath, barrel staves, mast trees, compass timbers, and cordwood, were transported in beamy brigs and schooners by sea, often on perilous journeys to towns where such lumber was scarce or to sites where sawmills were not yet established, such as mid-century California. Implicit in Lane's paintings are the artisanal acts and know-how that used this lumber to construct the houses and barns and bridges of antebellum America. One feels in his paintings a sense of respect, not only for the designers of ships and riggers of spars, but also for the loaders of wood and the builders of homes and the mariners who made this economy work. Castine was Lane's home base in Maine. He spent several weeks during many summers in the home of the town's physician, Dr. Joseph Stevens, just uphill from the harbor. There are substantial historic links between Cape Ann and coastal Maine, a Gloucester, Maine backstory of migration and remigration involving the Stevens family and Lane's own family, among many others. It's a narrative of dislocation and loss and aggression, as well as adventure, success, and apparent harmony. According to one art historian, Lane saw Maine as, and I quote, a more purified and untroubled place, conducive to resting and uplifting the spirit. From such a perspective, one could see this painting, Castine Harbor and Town of 1851, as exemplifying Nathaniel Hawthorne's view of the young United States. And I quote Hawthorne, "A country where there is no shadow, no antiquity, no mystery, no picturesque or gloomy wrong, nor anything but a commonplace prosperity and broad and simple daylight." Here, a lumber brig on the left catches the late afternoon light, and the day trippers in a little gaff rig schooner in the foreground appear to represent such an untroubled place of commonplace prosperity, seen in the clear and descriptive light of early evening. But Lane's paintings of the town of Castine and Penobscot Bay, I suggest, in fact, insist on Hawthornian intimations of shadow, antiquity, and gloomy wrong. Pictured from the perspective of a ruined revolutionary fort on the hill above the town, Castine, in this view of 1856, appears to be a well-ordered community of white clapboarded homes, churches, a rope walk, and schools clustered near the deep-watered harbor, the settlement's principal asset. A scene of haying occupies the sunny middle distance, but this is not just picturesque summer farm work. It's a crucial aspect of the logging industry. There was little meadowland for haying in 19th century Maine, and yet the oxen that provided the muscle of the logging industry couldn't survive their winter work without hay. It took as many as 14 oxen to draw a single log from the place where it grew to the nearest river. Hay to feed the oxen was valuable. Without hay, the oxen would starve. Without oxen, the logs could not move. One Maine lumber company put its competitors out of business by burning the competitors' supply of hay during this period. So the making of hay in Lane's painting signals the linkage of meadow to forest and the making of profit. Here, as elsewhere, Lane has underlined the relationships between land, individual labor, and broader economic communities. Against the darker green grass sprinkled with wildflowers in the foreground, a transaction is taking place. A bonneted Euro-American woman, parasol in hand, pauses in her walk to look at baskets proffered by two darkly clad women, their wares bundled in the grasp of the blue-shawled figure on the right and on the ground at their feet. Their untied hair, flat-brimmed hats, and copious shawls identify them as Native Americans. But these are not the befeathered warriors poised majestically with bow and arrow that figure in the romanticized landscape paintings of Lane's contemporaries, or the nubile Indian maidens of mid-century dime novels. These are stolid women, matter-of-fact women in hybrid clothing of Native Americans, living in physical and cultural proximity to Euro-American mid-century settlements. Sturdy baskets made of brown ash splints, a forest product fabricated from beaten ash logs, had long been crafted by the indigenous peoples of Maine, and they were sought after, prized, and used in the majority culture as indispensable and sturdy carry-alls. Indeed, a friend of Lane's hostess described Dorothy Stevens carrying such a basket. We can ask, what did Lane intend to suggest by the inclusion of these figures and these baskets in this painting? Perhaps he sought to describe the everyday character of contact with Native people in Castine, or the persistence of their very useful arts and crafts, or perhaps the deep history of not always so benign cultural contact in coastal Maine. Lane was alluding to the ways that Native Americans fit into the larger economies of Maine. We know that his hosts, the Stevens, visited nearby Wabanaki seasonal camps, and that a group of Penobscots were in Gloucester when that town went up in flames in 1830, and were credited with extinguishing the conflagration. That they frequented downtown Bangor in what one resident termed, and I quote, light and airy attire of blankets and paint, and that they owned and profited from renting valuable river frontage above Bangor to the operators of the Penobscot River boom, where annually thousands of logs were caught, sorted, rafted, and held until sold to mill operators. In the background, Lane and those in his community read weekly in the Gloucester newspapers about Indian removal, about conflict between settlers and native populations out west, and about policy debates concerning native tribes, treaties, and futures. These news reports would have inevitably brought to mind similar events distant in time from the artist's sojourns in Castine, but close in geography. Lane's host, Dr. Stevens, was an antiquarian, deeply informed about the history of Massachusetts and coastal Maine. On this 18th century map of Casco, Maine, you'll notice a fort and a blockhouse, indications of the hostilities between native and English populations. James Lane, the family's progenitor, was a woodworker who emigrated to Boston from London in 1655, and then in 1660 moved to Casco Bay, a landscape of farms and forts. In 1688, James, together with other settlers, was killed by Wabanakis. Two of his sons survived and retreated to Gloucester. John Lane, in the next generation, was a mariner. During a fishing trip in the summer of 1724, he put into Owl's Head to make repairs, where he was killed by Native Americans. John's grandson, William Lane, was also killed by Native Americans at Owl's Head on an unspecified date before 1760. These were not isolated incidents, nor were they simply acts on the part of an indigenous population resisting intrusion. After decades of more or less mutually accommodating trade relationships based on the exchange of furs for European metalwares and armaments, global forces impacted mutual trust and tribal analysis and alliances, disrupting a fragile trade-based status quo on this border between the English and French imperial projects in the New World. These local conflicts were, in other words, localized chapters in larger European wars and religious hostilities. Altogether, 6 of Lane's antecedents were killed by Native Americans between 1688 and 1760, some at Falmouth, now Portland, but most near the mouth of Penobscot Bay, where the artist summered and painted and sojourned in a household steeped in history. For Lane, then, the landscape of Maine was not at the untroubled place 20th century visitors to Maine experienced and valued, but a landscape in which grim historic events had happened that directly impacted both the ancestors of the basket makers that he painted and his own family's 5-generation life of retreat in Gloucester. The dramatic landmark, Owl's Head, a distinctive pair of steep hills on a prominent point at the mouth of Penobscot Bay, where the majestic estuary meets the Atlantic, had a private and ominous character for Lane as a site of the murder of kinsmen, as well as a more public character as a prominent public landmark. Lane painted Owl's Head repeatedly and gave a dark nocturnal view of the site to his main hostess, Dorothy Stevens. His best-known view of the site is this one, showing the pair of hills and lighthouse set off against a flat sea in the strait between the promontories Peninsula and Monroe Island in the pearly light of early morning. Lane's flat water views have usually been interpreted by scholars as the more contemplative, intellectually deeper works, more so than the choppy water paintings, which in fact were favored by his contemporaries. Lane invites introspection here by including a prominent turned figure in the foreground. This man is not rowing or cleaning fish or taking in sail or loading lumber. He's looking at the landscape, inviting the painter's viewer to look and think as well. Extremely unusual in Lane's earth, this contemplative figure, a viewer surrogate, most obviously suggests that the specific object of his attention, Owl's Head, is of particular import. The sight of Lane's kinsman's unforeseen deaths and the larger historic scene of deadly antagonism throughout centuries of Maine's history, it's a worthy object of contemplation. Equally unusual in Lane's work and equally masterful is Lane's Ships and an Approaching Storm off Owl's Head of 1860, in which the landmark is a ghostly dark rise looming between ominous cloud masses and the inky black sea. Even more beautifully painted than the chromatically subtle skies for which Lane is so celebrated, this monochromatic blanket of dark air with a sliver of light blue water at the horizon, interrupted by the dark mass of Owl's Head between the vessels, has astonishing depth and weight, at once fearsome and sublime. 7 sailors scramble in the rigging of the three-master in the middle of the painting and on the sloop to the left to furl sails and secure canvas as the blackening sky and dangerous winds, already in evidence in the background, threaten to carry these vessels onto the rocks. Few other subjects receive such sustained attention from Lane as Owl's Head. He pictured the distinctive promontory from the north and from the south, during night and during daytime, in gusty conditions and dead calm, as well as here, shrouded in tempestuous blackness. As a trope for memory and history, death and disaster, this double-humped promontory does well, inviting the viewer to see time, that is, events that it has witnessed, as well as geography of place. While the bounty of Maine's forests past this landmark outbound as lumber and fur to service the needs and desires of a global market, the quarrels and wars of European monarchs were transported inbound to royal Maine's coastal inhabitants, leaving an aura of Hawthornian shadow and gloomy wrong in the air more than a century after the antecedents of Lane's basket makers faced the antecedents of his basket buyers with mutual suspicion, animosity, and sometimes murderous intent. Castine, seemingly so modest in scale and quiet in outlook to modern eyes, was also the scene of major conflict and violence, the object of long-term global geopolitical rivalries and military action because of its deep water natural harbor near the mouth of Penobscot River. Its concentration of major importers and dealers in salt, the key ingredient in preserving marketable fish, and its proximity to major lumber resources, especially the white pines, coveted for masts by all major European naval powers, and to rich offshore fishing grounds, and to vast beaver-rich hinterlands populated by Native Americans eager to exchange their pelts for trade goods. Lane painted a second view of Castine, I'm showing you here, that instead of the basket sellers, includes a cannon as an unmistakable relic of turbulent historic times, characterized by aggression and hostility, as well as prosperity based on the three key extraction industries in early North America: fur, fish, and lumber. According to a notation on the preparatory drawing now in the collection of the Farnsworth Museum, Lane gave this painting with its foreground cannon to his host, Dr. Stevens, an amateur historian as well as a physician. The drawing notes, and I quote, 24 pounds, indicating the weight of the round stone or iron ball that the cannon was designed to fire at a muzzle velocity of 590 miles per hour. This cannon, a defanged, inert object of curiosity in Lane's day, was a serious instrument of death and destruction in its career as a weapon in a highly militarized town. Castine's harbor was the site of 5 naval engagements, and the town itself was besieged, occupied, razed, and fortified many times, a zone of shifting sovereignty that saw in quick succession conquest and reconquest by 4 different nations, keen to control and exploit its highly sought-after resources. According to one historian, Castine in 1860 was, and I quote, said to be the wealthiest town in Maine in proportion to its size, maintaining its prosperity even as it was bypassed by the railroad. Others claimed that it was, from 1830 to 1840, the second wealthiest town per capita in the country. Castine's prosperity began in the mid-16th century, as did its identity as a prize fought over by French, English, Dutch, and even American forces. The cannon included in Lane's view of Castine from Fort George is no incidental detail, but a pointed reference not only to the ramparts of the Revolutionary era fort on which the artist sat to make the preliminary sketch, but also to the whole complex international history of violence and contested possession, literally underfoot. It's been said that Lane's canvases depict, as I say, a conflict between civilization and wilderness, but there's little evidence that Lane was interested in anything as grand as civilization or as wild as wilderness. His paintings evidence an artist interested in how humans have used resources, built community, and retained memory of the past. His paintings are neither grand celebrations nor national elegies. Their narratives are most often of small events that he, his friends, his patrons recognized as representing quotidian occurrences: the loading of boards, the reefing of sails, the cutting of hay, all resonant of a deep human history and complex economic and social webs. So how about those patrons, those men and women who encouraged him and enabled Lane to make a living by buying his paintings and commissioning works? So I'd like to give you now a portrait of one of them. The patron I'd like to talk to you about today is Sidney Mason. He was born 5 years earlier than Lane in Gloucester, the son of John Mason, the town surveyor, windmill operator, proprietor of the Brick Gloucester Hotel, and director of Gloucester's poorhouse. This is a handsome topographic map that John Mason drew of Cape Ann and had lithographed in Boston at the firm that Lane would soon join. John Mason sent his son Sidney to Boston, the future patron of Lane, to Boston when he was 12 years old to learn how to be a merchant. Working his way up from janitorial assignments through clerkship posts at 21, he was acting as his company's agent and supercargo in the West Indies, and on the side, making business decisions on his own behalf with a part interest in a schooner. Settling in Puerto Rico in 1821, he displayed unusual cultural pliancy in obeying the stringent regulations for foreigners in this, one of Spain's 2 remaining colonies in the Western Hemisphere, converting immediately to Catholicism and swearing an oath of allegiance to the Spanish crown. He learned Spanish with sufficient fluency that he admitted to a friend in 1831 that he preferred speaking Spanish to English. In 1850, Sidney Mason was commissioned a suite of paintings from Lane, including this image of the city of San Juan from across the bay. The ship in the detail points with it, the larger ship in the image points with its bowsprit to Mason's harborside consular office and to his home above it within the massive 40-foot thick city walls that were built in the 16th century. In the harbor, a variety of vessels fly Sidney Mason's flag, a white circle within a red field. Mason married into the local military autocracy in 1823, and he did well. Puerto Rico in the early 19th century was monocultural and developed as a military base using transported convict labor rather than enslaved Africans. When Sidney Mason arrived, the island had little to export, a population with little capital, little education, and much of its territory was mountainous forests with verdant, uncultivated valleys. Puerto Rico, as a military bastion, lacked a business or planter elite. So the Spanish crown made efforts to attract Catholic loyalists from Spain and France's rebellious New World colonies, who were encouraged to bring their capital, technical expertise, and their African slaves to enable Puerto Rico to become a profitable plantation-based colonies, competitive with other Caribbean islands. The military government was, however, nervous about liberation-minded troublemakers on the one hand and slave insurrections on the other. They were also nervous about foreigners, even as they realized that openness to foreign capital and expertise was necessary to achieve their economic goals, and that the primary market for the staple crops that they encouraged, sugar, coffee, tobacco, would be North America. Puerto Rican scholars credit Mason with being instrumental in this modernization, especially for introducing banking to the island. And Mason, who was a merchant and was appointed U.S. consul in 1829, he encouraged the production and export of Puerto Rican produce, which we see showing up in newspaper advertisements in Gloucester during Mason's years in Puerto Rico. The detail of this watercolor map of Puerto Rico indicates the point from which Lane's painting observes the city of San Juan on the left, and on the right, the site of the plantation that Sidney Mason bought in 1828, still a young man in his 20s. So at the age of 28, with a wife whose uncle was governor of the island, Mason was doing well, and he purchased a sugar plantation a few hours by boat and horseback from San Juan, for which he had a map made, as you see there on the left. And the main house was photographed a century later in the photograph on the right. We know a great deal about Mason, his homes, his activities in the early 1830s from 2 sources. His granddaughter, who wrote a family history early in the 20th century, and from the Emerson family. In 1831, Mason hired Edward Bliss Emerson, brother of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who had come to the tropics in an effort to recover from tuberculosis. Emerson lived in Mason's household, traveled with him, and assisted him in his consular duties and his business ventures until Edward Bliss Emerson died in Puerto Rico in 1834. Emerson kept a journal and wrote copious letters back to New England. After all, he was a New Englander. A second Emerson brother, Charles, also suffering from tuberculosis, also spent months with Mason in the household, and he also wrote home copiously. The Emersons saw Puerto Rico through New England eyes, and while they found much to admire, they found it difficult to understand a culture in which there were, and I quote, no lectures, no sermons, no reading rooms, no public libraries, no bookstores, no participatory government, no literature, no independent press, and no educational institutions. This group of what cultural amenities were what the Emersons understood to be the attributes of a good society, entirely absent here. They also cast a critical eye on the institution of slavery, characterizing the island as, Edward Bliss Emerson put it, a nest of suffering and wrong. Now, Edward Bliss Emerson, who had a Harvard degree and a classical education and read avidly in literature, philosophy, and history, spoke Italian, French, Greek, and Spanish. And he had traveled to Europe and written on art and meditated frequently on the meaning and purpose of human existence. He daily offered an alternative model to Sidney Mason, whose own education had been curtailed when he was 12 years old and channeled so completely into business. When Mason decided to leave Puerto Rico after 13 years on the island, his articulated reason for doing so was to seek educational opportunities for his children, suggesting that the Emersons had had an important influence on his thinking and his life. In 1834, as I said, Edward Bliss Emerson died, and Mason began the complex process of moving his family and his business to the United States. I believe that this painting by Lane, Baltimore from Federal Hill, retrospectively records this re-migration. Mason, his Spanish wife, and his children stopping off in Baltimore, the primary U.S. port that Mason used for his business ventures. The re-entry was not easy. Shortly after resettling in Gloucester, his wife died, as did his 10-year-old son. Unmoored, he put his daughter in boarding school and traveled to Europe. In the 1840s, Mason, returning to the U.S., moved to New York City, although he continued to visit and own property in and invest in and donate to philanthropic causes in his native Gloucester. In New York, he continued his international shipping activities and got involved in insurance and banking and railroads. He also started the city's urban transit system by establishing the first horse car line going up and down 6th Avenue in Manhattan. Continued financial success enabled Mason to build this marble mansion on 5th Avenue, where he lived from 1847 until his death in 1871. Also living with him were his daughter, her husband, their children, and a new young wife. Family documents indicate that, and I quote, the interior of this marble 5th Avenue home was filled with works of art and beautiful furniture, some of which was made of mahogany from Puerto Rico and grown on his plantation, Santa Catalina, and fashioned from designs selected during his visits to Europe. This comment reminds us of the foreground vignette of the San Juan painting in which two men wrangle logs. Mahogany was, of course, the most expensive lumber circulating in the Atlantic. In the early 1850s, in a retrospective frame of mind, Mason commissioned at least 5 and possibly as many as 8 paintings from Lane to embellish this house and to keep before him important chapters in his life. 3 of them were cityscapes: Gloucester, San Juan, Baltimore, and New York Harbor, with a glorious clipper ship heading out for global trade to distant ports. All of these paintings are of a uniform size, except the Gloucester view, which is larger, and I suspect that they were hung together as a set. The view of Gloucester was given to the city by Mason's last living direct descendant, Cassie Mason Myers Julian James, early in the 20th century. It includes on the left a view of the Pavilion Hotel right there at the edge of the painting, built by Mason as the city's first tourist hotel on the site of his father's windmill, facing the beach and the harbor. Together, this set of paintings can be read as a kind of biography of Sidney Mason, written in pictures describing and interpreting places of great significance to him and to his family. How about Lane? Did he do autobiographical paintings? That's trickier, but I would say at least 2 seemed introspective about his own role in the world. New England Inlet on the left is a meditation on the project to paint Cape Ann, and an attestation that he is an eyewitness to the scenes that he depicts, that he is a truth teller. The second painting on the right has historically borne the title Salem Harbor. Although there are no geographical features to point specifically to Salem, the majestic clipper that fills the right side of the image is characteristic of Salem-based vessels, and the painting belonged to and was probably commissioned by Nathaniel Silsby Jr., mayor of Salem, representative in Massachusetts legislature, treasurer of Harvard University, and partner in a firm prominent in the Sumatra pepper trade. Clippers frequented Salem, as well as Boston, New York, and Baltimore. They did not frequent Gloucester. Billowing gray cumulus clouds frame the bright, precise trapezoids of canvas on display. At least 18 sails are carried to extreme heights by the ship's towering masts, and to extraordinary breadth by the studding sail booms extending considerably beyond its sides. Everything about this ship, from the yardage of canvas on the superstructure to the trim profile of its bow and raking stern, promises speed and blue water ambition. It seems sleek and new, and indeed clippers were novel when this picture was painted in 1853. Clipper ships' design sacrificed carrying capacity for extreme speed. In the rush to California for gold and to China and Indonesia for tea, spices, silk, and porcelain, swiftness trumped cargo space. Capable of traversing 465 nautical miles a day, clippers outpaced the sturdy merchantmen of the 1840s by a factor of 2 or even 3. At rest here, its bright new canvas drying and hanging flat, the ship nevertheless promises exceptional athletic prowess and exceptional profits. We do not know the name of this ship, but Silsby owned ships with names like Borneo, Malay, and Delphos, suggesting in their exotic names the far-flung reaches of his commerce. 8 other ships and boats surround and provide contrast to the glorious clipper. Of these, the artist has drawn attention to a small dory and a little schooner in the foreground. In these, he's injected a counter-narrative about local, vernacular, humble shipping in Salem Harbor. On the canvas of the modest schooner with its mismatched, much-patched sails, Lane comments on the canvas of sails and the canvas of paintings, about words and names and identity. This little vessel, its sails catching just enough air to keep the oars idle, is propelled by sails composed of narrow strips of gray and tan canvas, frugally sewn together, sails very unlike the broadloom whole cloth matched set that the majestic clipper displays. Lane has included his own initials, painted in vermilion on the middle of these worn and much mended sails, identifying himself as local, slow, old-fashioned, and dog-eared in the company of the gallant, new, and elegantly equipped ocean trader on the right. The deferential posture of this gesture, however, is somewhat offset by the centrality and prominence of the artist's claim to authorship and creativity at the very center of his patron's heroic celebration of the Pacific-bound clipper ship, pressed here a little bit to the side. After all, he seems to say, who's going to be remembered in the long run? So I thank you for your attention, and I welcome your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Margaretta. You've given us a lot to think about. And I think we've got a couple of questions that are percolating here in the Q&A box that I'll reach for in just a moment. But one thing that I have to be honest, I feel like a student, I'm taking notes over here, but one thing that really sparked me, and I'm thinking perhaps it sparked a couple of other people's imagination, is, really looking at the canvases of Fitz Henry Lane and thinking about not only how much he's depicted in his canvases, but how much is not depicted, and how much is implied, and how much is suggested, and how much is sort of behind the scenes, if you will, when you're looking at the social context and the social history. I mean, would you say that, or could you say that, Fitz Henry Lane was part of a greater social influence at this time, considering other artists that were working alongside of him, and when you're also bringing in, some wonderful references to the Emersons and obviously transcendentalists. But, was he sort of part of a wave of social thought at the time? Do you think he was influential in that way?
Interestingly enough, Lane is not associated with any other artists. We only know of one other artist, an Englishman working in Boston, that he that he had any association with, and we only know that because of a morsel of writing on the back of a canvas. He didn't go to art school. He did spend years in Boston learning how to be a lithographer in association with artists like Champney. But in Gloucester, where he did his painting career, he was really it. It was him and the guys who painted signs and boats, right? So he wasn't part of a movement. He wasn't part of an association of artists. He did send some canvases to Boston and to New York to be exhibited, and they were never. I mean, the most he ever got for a canvas was $500. Most of his canvases were about $100, which is about the cost of a horse. So not immaterial, but nothing like, Frederick Church and is selling paintings for 5,000 and up to 10,000 at the time. So he's not really, he's not then competing with them, although today his canvases are competing with them. And in some ways, his paintings are of higher value. In some of his paintings, in some markets, are of higher value than those others of his contemporaries at the time. So was he part of a movement? Was he part of? No, he was the town's artist, right? He painted, fire screens. He painted floats and organized parades and he painted something for the post office. He actually even did paint signs to be hung outside of businesses. So everybody knew him and knew him as the town's artist. There was no art gallery. There was no art. The only vending of art were people who came to his studio and commissioned or bought paintings there. So was he part of a social movement? He was very much part of his community. Let me put it that way, and clearly had a great deal of affection for that community of Gloucester, but also his sort of adopted community of Castine.
Thank you. And I think that, it's interesting because it's such a fascinating time period, certainly in history. And we do think of all of these artists working together, but you've certainly pointed out, obviously, that a lot of them, sometimes that's an historical view, if you will, that some of them were sort of working on their own or part of their community, but in different ways. Margaretta, I do have a question that's come in some commentary as well. So I'll share that with you in full. And it's from what I'll say is a devoted fan of yours. So I think you'll recognize this is from Will, who says, "Thank you for a fascinating lecture that clarifies the rich economic, political, and social layers of the quiet old paintings. Observers of the artistic response to Maine's extractive industries were struck by the synchronicity with your topic yesterday when the news came that the visible remaining trace of the industries here in the Farnsworth region, here in Mid-Coast, Maine, the limestone quarrying and processing plant, will wind down operations in December. Now that the coast and islands lumber trade of Lane's canvases is a distant memory and centuries-long limestone industry of Greater Rockland will soon become one. Could you share any reflections on how the historic visual culture of these industries can be useful to the people in evolving economies of Mid-Coast Maine?"
Wow.
So that's a long question, but it's an interesting time because I think that so much of what we've talked about today is very timely with what we're thinking about with climate, environment, and the changing of industries, especially here in Maine.
Well, I would say, there's so many things going on in that comment, and hi, Will, that the historic industries of an area always leave a trace. Even if the buildings are torn down or repurposed, and even if they seem to not, they always leave a trace. I think the important thing is to remember and to use those traces to help us understand why the streets are laid out the way they're laid out, why the wharfs are where they are. We tend to take the built environment that we arrive into as a fixed thing, but it isn't. It's part of decision making, and so it's a trace of somebody's idea about how the world should work. So just to become conscious of that, even if the most obvious traces of those industries and efforts and community are gone, and how can it help us in the present to the simple answer to that is to say that what Lane was painting was an economy that worked, and it worked with the environment, and it worked, although it was in some ways rapacious in terms of the number of fish extracted, the number of trees cut down. It still allowed nature to recover. Let's put it that way. And I think we should be sort of mindful of an economy in which that is possible, that that it isn't just the present generation and its greed that is to be satisfied, or its needs, right? It's not just the needs and greeds. It's also a sense of, what's the downstream effect of every decision that we make? It just helps us be mindful. And as I say, the thing about paintings is that they are moments of the past that have survived into the present, that help us understand not only what the world looked like, but how the world worked and what it meant to the people within it. As you're absolutely right to say, there are many things that are not pictured. Lane does not picture a devastated forest, with slash left for miles. For starters, he couldn't get there. He was disabled. He needed crutches to ambulate, and so he does not go off into the forest either intact or destroyed. But it's in the background. He's reminding us that it's in the background, whereas Church and Kensett and the other artists are just simply averting their eyes entirely. So that's a meandering response to an interesting and thought-provoking question.
No, actually, it's a perfect response, actually, because it actually helps segue into what our last question is, which actually may have partly answered it. Someone has asked if many, basically commented that many of his paintings are of these sort of calm, placid waters, that he's so well known for. Did he paint storm waves? Did he paint things that were stormy? We know certainly he wasn't looking for the ravages of the axe, shall we say, of Thomas Cole, but, was he painting things that were stormier? I think he had one painting in there that looked a little bit tempestuous, but in general, are there canvases out there that are a little stormier?
This is a very good and actually a wide-ranging question, because his contemporaries particularly praised his painting of tempestuous seas. They thought that his capacity to depict turbulent water surpassed not only anyone else in North America, but anyone else in the world. I mean, and this includes critics in New York. The few that made some comments about him were just, lavish praise on those paintings. From the middle of the 20th century, it was the flat water paintings that got all the press and got the high values at auctions because they were associated with a greater sense of introspective spirituality. So in other words, it depends on what eyes are looking at the works. And all you need to do is track the auction records to see who is valuing what. You don't even have to read what the critics say, because paintings of the same size by the same artist, painted with the same skill, will have vastly different values on the market if people see one as somehow more intellectually rich than another. And in our culture, the dangerous moment at sea is not a particularly interesting thing. Let me put it that way. That's not a particularly interesting subject to us. It was to his contemporaries.
So maybe that's something to end on. Tempestuousness is in the eye of the beholder. So it all depends, I suppose. Margaretta, you've given us so much to think about, really. And it's just a fascinating talk. And I feel like I could talk with you for hours about it. And I'm sure our listeners today feel the same way. So I want to thank you so much for your time this morning, this afternoon, depending on the time zone that you're all in. Thank you very much for joining us. And I know the book is available through, is it Penn State University Press? Do I have that right?
Yes.
Book is available through Penn State University Press, just published this year. And also for those of you in Mid-Coast Maine, if you're looking for more Farnsworth events, please feel free to go on our website to our events page where you're going to see everything listed. I should just mention that coming up on September 24th, we have Beautiful Blackbird Festival. We're partnering with Indigo Arts Alliance and CMCA and several other area partners to have author Dinah Johnson here. We're also soon opening up Every Leaf and Twig, Andrew Wyeth's Botanical Imagination, which opens up on September 16th. And a lot of these works have never been seen by the public before, so that's coming up on the 16th. Marsden, Hartley, and the Sea is coming up, opening up on October 6th. And then Farnsworth at 75th anniversary exhibition continues through December 31st of this year. So thank you again, Margaretta, and thank you all for supporting us here at the Farnsworth, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks very much. Take care.